Thank you. It's just wonderful to be here, to see some familiar faces and to be back in Newcastle. So I'll talk a little bit about me, but I actually worked in a physio practice just up on the corner here in Broadmeadow Medical Centre, and I had a practice in Stockton as well. So that was a different career, I guess, before this one. So it's awesome to be back and wonderful to be talking to you guys because, you know, as Amy said, you guys are the critical drivers, you know, for your child's sporting potential, you know, and their development. You guys are critical in that regard. So I just want to indulge me a little bit, and I'll give you a little bit of background about me. So a long time ago, and I've got a dear volleyball friend, Katrina, that we used to play at school. I actually played for New South Wales. So I was a young girl from Port Macquarie. Katrina, my dear buddy, was from Kendall. Were you from Kendall? Dunbogan. Yeah. So I'm actually there. So I've done the journey, I guess, as a New South Wales athlete. As well, I got to a sort of a pre-lead athlete level, and I played volleyball. So I played volleyball for New South Wales in the underages. I was actually a talent transfer athlete, so that's why I had such a weird spike action. I was actually a javelin thrower and a hockey player, and then I was brought into volleyball, and we had a wonderful coach, Robert Savage, that used to take us up and down in his combi van, up and down the coast nearly every weekend. So I guess I just wanted to sort of show you, that background. But I guess my claim to fame was a bit after that. I'm actually in the Best Of album of the Angels. So I'm here next to, it's a bit hard to see, but Doc Neeson. So the rocket Doc Neeson, bless him, because he did pass, but when I was on scholarship at the AIS for volleyball, who would have thought the Doc was so passionate about women's volleyball? You know, and he could see that our program was going to close down, and we ended up playing this exhibition match at the AIS. I thought I was getting stitched up because they said, come and play the Angels, and I thought, yeah, sure, you know. And we turned up, and there's all these lights and recording, you know, apparatus, and there's Doc Neeson, you know, and all the Brewster brothers. And I was underage, and I you know, Doc took me under his wing. He was a fantastic fatherly figure, and I ended up on stage, but don't tell anyone, I was still underage, in Royals, which is like a pub in Canberra. And we ended up on stage playing, you know, the instruments and everything. And anyway, we're in there, in that Best Of album. No one believes me, so I always like to put that up there. So I guess I reached my peak as a pre-lead athlete. I think looking back now, you know, I probably got as far as I could have gotten, I think, with my stature, you know, and my technical ability. And I played, I guess, I was in a junior fringe squad for Australia, and I was more a backcourt player, a libero. I was too small, you know, for the front court. And that's a picture of me there, number 3. But the problem was because I had that strange action with the javelin, so I had a very side-on sort of spiking action. And I guess we trained so hard on wooden floors like this, I ended up with stress fractures in my back, which was quite prophetic because then I ended up studying that in cricketers, in fast bowlers and cricketers, and I started a PhD actually looking at stress fractures as well. And that then led me to, I guess, stopping my volleyball career because we were having to go and train in Adelaide every second weekend, and I was studying sports science and I wanted to do physio. So I ended up doing physio at Sydney Uni. But I guess while I was doing the physio degree, and I loved physio, I got a lot of intrinsic satisfaction out of helping patients. And it was wonderful having a practice at Stockton. But I guess I was always interested from a young age reading about the histories of Olympians and about particularly Don Bradman. I was fascinated, you know, with Sir Donald Bradman, you know, with the cricket stump and the water tank and the golf ball. And I was really interested in the development of expertise. So how does that happen? How did Don go from being a young child, and I've got a great picture of him, you know, and you can already see how in tune he is, you know, as a wiki, you know, in this particular picture, How did he go to become such an amazing expert? So I was given an opportunity, the first Cricket Australia scholarship. So I did my PhD with Cricket Australia, and that was interesting. I was actually at Del Monte in Adelaide. Shane Watson was in that crew, Ben Hilfenhaus, some really notable cricketers, and I was the only female in that dormitory, which was quite interesting with all the male cricketers. But I lived and breathed their journey for 3 months at Del Monte, and that was part of my PhD. And I was also fortunate to interview, because I wanted to learn about Don Bradman. How did he become that expert? So I spoke to Alan Border. I got to speak to Greg Chappell, and I got to hang out with Justin Langer, and talking to those guys and learning about the development of expertise and how they developed their expertise. And so I ended up putting together a bit of a test battery based on what they thought was important. And I was able to test 111 batsmen from the age of 10 all the way up to Australian senior level, and looking at their technical ability, their anticipatory ability, how they could read the bowler and make a good decision, their anthropometrics, their physiology, their socio-developmental background, the whole gamut, this holistic test battery. And I put together, and it was published, a model, I guess, of expertise for cricket batting. And then it was used for Cricket Australia, and they ended up doing a similar thing for bowling, and wicket keeping. So I guess this then whet my appetite. I was through the PhD, I was really interested in, how do experts in sport develop? And that then led me to working with the AIS, so the National Talent ID program, and then the Pathways program. And through our evidence, we could see that my next challenge was addressing a bit of an unhealthy athlete pathway in Australia across many, many sports. And we could see that if you look at the red is below 50, the amber's about 51 to 70%, we could see through different evidence gathering that we were really battling with a bit of an unhealthy pathway. And we could then see that that was leading to constraints on individual athletes' potential, their development, because of those constraints in the pathway. And this was leading to a compromised profile, for those athletes. And it was leading to a limit in their physical literacy, to burnout, to dropout, to injury, like that I grappled with as a pre-elite athlete, but also importantly, unfilled talent potential as well. So we realised that we needed to do something about that. That there were issues at the strategy level, across Australia within all the major national sporting organisations collectively that we had to address. There were issues in terms of coaching, in terms of support of athletes, and that really was the impetus to put together FTEM, which is stands for Foundation, Talent, Elite and Mastery. And it really is a framework, a strategic framework that helps sporting organisations and stakeholders to better understand what does a healthy pathway look like. What do we need in terms of strategy and support and coaching and so forth to really make it more seamless for athletes, to better support athletes, and that athletes are happier, they're fulfilled, they're not injured, and they're reaching that talent potential so that we've got a more healthy talent pipeline. So I was really, it was amazing. Again, that was a funny episode. I got an invitation to present FTEM to the IOC, so the International Olympic Committee in 2014. And it was on April Fool's Day. And I thought, right, I've been stitched up. Why would they want to talk to me? The IOC. And, I'd read about the IOC. I had books as a young kid, about Olympians. And I knew about, de Coubertin. And anyway, I got it, and it was fair income. And then I thought, I went through a few months of, oh my goodness, soul searching and thinking, gosh, this is going to be a bit, nerve-wracking, presenting FTEM. But they were particularly interested in FTEM because there is the LTAD model. Are you guys aware of that, the Canadian model? So they knew there were some issues, the long-term athlete development model in Canada. They knew there were some issues with that. So they were very interested to hear what the Aussies had, in terms of the FTEM athlete development framework. And you can read a bit more about it. I've got a book chapter if you're interested. It's really great content if you want to go to sleep at night. But it will explain all about the FTEM framework and what the best practice is. But here I am. This is actually on the first morning. So I'm in this entourage outside the de Coubertin room, which is the main room of the IOC. When I turned up the night before, I was a bit jet lagged. The security guy wouldn't let me in. He didn't think I was part of the entourage. And we were having this special dinner, and I had to sort of convince him, look, I am actually part of the group. So anyway, it was a really impressive group, with these amazing international experts that I'd read about at uni, and then I was mixing it with them, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is surreal. This is like ticking off my, bucket list. But there's a certain fellow at the back there, and I'd read that he was on the list of attendees, and that was Gary Hall Jr. So Gary Hall Jr., remember him from Sydney 2000? 5-time Olympic gold medalist, swimmer, amazing guy. Now I thought I was going to turn up and he was going to be dressed like this. Somehow I thought that, and he'd be doing the shadow boxing that he was known for. But then I realised it was actually a persona. He's the most gentle, modest, humble guy, and he's a dear friend. And this was his, his performer, his performer persona. He's actually quite a shy, lovely fellow. And he's an amazing guy doing amazing things for athletes in America. He really cares about health and well-being and welfare. And he actually had diabetes, so he does a lot of work in terms of education and research in diabetes for athletes. So I was really daunted. I was like, oh my goodness, in that entourage and Gary Hall as well. But through that, we were able to put together a consensus statement, and that's why I was there. So to put together this consensus statement on youth athlete development from the IOC. So that's a good read. I mean, I am a bit biased because I did contribute to it, but it is a pretty simple and good read, and it talks about all the key issues that are facing athletes and what needs to be done in terms of strategy and practice, to help address burnout, injury, psychological burnout and so forth. And a fellow that's a fantastic infographic fellow, he did this wonderful infographic, and I have that as a poster. So it's a good reminder, there's some good messaging in there about the key things that are required for, healthy, fulfilling, enjoyable sport experience for young athletes. But I guess I was so inspired by Gary. Gary opened up the address. He spoke about warts and all, his own experiences, what he went through, as an athlete, and what he witnessed. He had swimmers, fellow swimmers that really battled, in terms of their health, their psychological health, in terms of eating disorders. There were issues with coaches. So he's very passionate about athletes not going through the same experience, and that's really what drives him to the work that he does now. And it inspired me so much that I realised in Australia, we need to do a better job of listening to athletes and to listen to developing athletes about their experiences and get their perspectives. Commonly, we can, in terms of strategy level, we can make assumptions, but we're not living the experience. We really need to be in touch with those that are living the experience and understand what's working and what's not working for them, rather than make assumptions as to what we think is important or what should be done. So I put this paper, editorial paper, that is alongside the IOC consent paper. But that paper then, led to subsequent work that I did at the AIS about tapping in and engaging the athlete's voice. But I guess my proudest achievement to date, and my little guys are here, are my two little boys. So I guess, I'm still learning. Oh my goodness, I thought I had it sorted, in terms of development and But, as a parent, as you know, you're learning every day, but I relish that, learning every day and having to adapt. And I think just as well I did the cricket PhD because my boys love playing cricket and we played in all different environments. And so I'm using, I guess, in a funny way, they were my guinea pigs a little bit too in the corridor when they were babies, but in a nice way. But yeah, it's been wonderful, the journey, as a parent and learning and adapting, and I know sometimes it's a hard gig, but it's the most fulfilling role that I've had, in my life. So the My Sporting Journey Questionnaire. So it's a questionnaire we put together to sort of source the athlete's perspective, and it's a big questionnaire based, I guess, on, inspired by Gary. Wanted to understand the whole developmental journey of athletes holistically and what we could do better at the AIS in terms of strategy and practice. And we ended up it's a big project. We got over 1,500 athletes that filled out the questionnaire, so a huge data set, and a good mix-up of individual and team sports. We had a fantastic cohort of senior international athletes, so we got 450 athletes that have represented Australia as a junior or an adult, a senior as an adult. And we have 160 athletes in that cohort that actually medalled, at the World Champs, Olympics, Paralympics. And in there we do have a mix of line of questioning for Paralympians as well as able-bodied athletes too. And the great thing about this questionnaire that 84% of athletes that filled it out were still competing. So they were still living and breathing, the experience and the journey. So wonderful set of evidence and data. That information has subsequently informed major reviews that we did while I was working at the AIS with Tennis Australia, with Athletics Australia, with Sailing Australia. That evidence, sourcing the athlete's voice through that questionnaire, was the critical bits of evidence that we were using to really review, the pathway operations of these organisations. It led to us tweaking our FTEM strategy, looking at, that's a bit of a 3D model of athlete development. It allowed us to really look at what the athlete profile looks like, what are the key environmental factors supporting that profile, and what is the key system support to support the athlete. It also allowed us to put together the top 10 tips for parents that I'll talk about a little bit later. So it was key evidence that informed that. It informed the strategy work that I touched on for, I think, about 30 national sporting organisations. One of the last ones was working with Tennis Australia, which was wonderful. I shared a room with Leighton Hewitt, and it was amazing just sharing and talking about his profile and how he developed, and he wasn't sure of me either, but it was good fun sort of mixing it with him and, talking about his developmental experiences and what really is key to the young tennis players coming up now, what their profile looks like and how we can better nurture and support those tennis players. And then it also informed two other projects for the AIS, the base camp strategy. Some of you might be aware of that because there were some Regional Academy athletes that had access to my AIS base camp last year, and also our self-regulation strategy that really looks at honing psychological skills of athletes. What we found from the My Sporting Journey questionnaire that it's not a linear progression and development, definitely not that at all. It's actually quite lots of peaks and troughs in an athlete's development, and that's the realism, of the pathway, and that's a really important thing to remember. It's not always very smooth sailing. A lot of our finest athletes have had disappointment, but then that's inspired and that's made them passionate and really committed and enthusiastic to then go that next step. That's an important characteristic, and I'll talk about that in a sec. So we found that to get to the top, you definitely need the strong foundations, and I'll unpack that a little bit, what those key things are as the launch pad, for a successful journey up that developmental pathway. But also as a pre-lead athlete, It's about committing and identifying as pre-elite athletes, so really owning that identity and committing to it. It's about managing peer dynamics, which can be tricky, where it can be very competitive, and we've got some very interesting data on that. It's about how to communicate with your coach. It's about juggling, work, university, school, with your sporting commitments, how you do that effectively. It's dealing with chance events. Chance events are those events that are out of your control. That could be an injury or a loss of a coach. So how do you bounce back, and how can you be pragmatic about that? It's about negotiating the transition from a junior to a senior, which is a massive jump at times. Dealing with stressors, and also then your first time experiences as a junior, mixing it with senior elite athletes, your new kid on the block. How do you do that confidently? And particularly on the world stage. We learnt from our athletes that, it's very, very daunting. A lot of the times they don't have enough exposure and preparation. So what can we do to better support and expose them so that they can ultimately go up and be comfortable at the senior international level? And just to, reiterate the fact that that pathway is quite non-linear, we had a paper in 2013 that really showed the trajectories of our finest Olympic athletes, 256 of them. And we found that the pathway is chaotic. We could see that it's not just a very pure ascent up. The junior ranks, it's not that at all. For a lot of sports, it's you go up to a junior level, then you drop down, and then you go up the senior levels. And then there's a lot of concurrent junior and senior exposure that happens too. That's an important catalyst, for developing expertise, but that has to be carefully managed. Now, when's the right timing for a talented junior to then step into the senior ranks? That has to be very carefully managed. That athlete has to be ready, and they have to have a supportive environment. But it's certainly a hallmark of a lot of our finest athletes that they've mixed that junior and senior competitive exposure. So the athlete and environmental profile, to get to the very top, looks a bit like this. So we know we have a very full profile. Key is the psychological attributes and skills. You can have natural talent physically, but you've got to be committed and motivated. You've got to be able to learn and evolve with practice and competitive exposure. And so psych attributes are really, really critical. But as well as, your genetics, how coordinated you are, your physical literacy, your sport-specific skills, your practice and competition exposure. So it's quite a full profile. But we know to nurture that profile, you have to have all these key environmental catalysts working together. And you guys are, up the top there in terms of family and parents. You are key and fundamental, particularly in the foundational levels and going through the pre-elite levels. The support can change through the pathway, but I'll touch on that a little bit later. So in terms of what we found in terms of foundation, what do you need to have to really optimise, the launch pad for an athlete? And we found from our data that strong parental support is important. So encouraging parents, but parents that have commonly done the journey themselves and have played sport, but also are providing lots of resources to their children. It's emotional, it's informational, it's monetary. It's very, very multifactorial, but a primary driver. The sibling effect, we found that it was interesting. A lot of our finest athletes are younger born. So if you think about, you've got the parent that's done the journey in sport, and commonly these younger born athletes have got older siblings that have done the journey too. So this younger sibling has the parents that have done it and the older sibling. So it's quite, it's quite cushy in some regards because they've, those people have done the journey, and the younger one can learn, from that and benefit from that. So very interesting. Fundamentals, a lot of our finest athletes had wonderful fundamental movement skills, full proficiency, and they realised that they had that full proficiency, and that led to a self-confidence and self-belief. Lots of free play. This is really important in terms of what they call deliberate play. You know, a lot of our finest athletes, like Don Bradman, did a lot of free play in their home environment, in the neighbourhood, you know, at school. They weren't just going to training, but they were honing their skills, you know, in the home environment. And that is really, really critical. And I guess at a strategy practice level, we go, well, free play is important at home. How do we keep that, considering we're getting smaller backyards and, you know, kids are in suburbia, but how do we maintain that importance of free play through the pathway for older athletes too, you know, to keep the fun and the enjoyment and the challenge. So that's a key one. Sample, sample, sample is a key one. Our finest athletes, they've sampled at least 4 to 5 different sports, and they've attributed that to where they got to in their main sport. They brought the skills, you know, from those former sports into that main sport. So it's really important. They specialise later too. So they're sampling until around the ages of 13 to 15, and they specialise around that age. So it's always a bit later. They're a sporty child. They've got the strong self-belief in their ability, but someone taps them on the shoulder too and says, look, you've got the goods. You know, they're recognised as having that talent potential. So their own belief is then verified, I guess, confirmed by, you know, that external supportive source. And this is an important one, and we touched on it before, afforded progression. So a lot of these finest athletes in their foundational years, so the early participation, were allowed to play and compete against older athletes. And that was important for developing their profile. But as I said, it has to be very carefully managed because you don't want to sort of propel an athlete up if they're not ready. You know, if they're not psychologically ready, technically ready, physically ready. But that is certainly a hallmark of our finest athletes. So we know that it's a combination of all these factors that really is that launch pad, you know, for our finest athletes. In the pre-elite levels, we know that self-regulation is key, and I'll talk about that in a minute, about being self-aware, about being good in terms of organisational skill, in terms of problem solving, in terms of continual reflection. It's a really key set of attributes and skills that's important for sport, but it's important for academia, it's important for life. You know, it's so important. Having the right coach-athlete match is important, and the athlete having some empowerment to make sure they got the right match, you know, as well. Managing peers in and out of sport, as I touched on, when we ask questions about positive peer interaction, but negative peer interaction, we found for female athletes in particular, there was a high percentage, about a quarter, had said that they'd had negative impact from peers. So that alerted us to what can we do in terms of educating young female athletes and empowering them to deal with potentially negative peer dynamics, but also what do we do with coaches and in terms of the environments to make sure it's more positive and nurturing and supportive. Because if you think about it, there could be a huge dropout because of that factor. So there was a lot of female athletes talking about being bullied, being harassed, and so forth. And I think in, you know, our younger generation now with social media, you know, it's a really, really critical thing we need to look at. Managing workloads. This is about the training competitive workload. So that's not onerous and over the top and leading to injury and dropout and burnout, but it's also about managing, you know, their life, you know, their academic commitments with their sport commitments, and making sure that they've got time, you know, to rest, to recover, to reflect, to regenerate. That's really, really critical. Having good athlete and lifestyle skills, and I'll talk about that. There's a whole suite of those that you guys, you know, you can help empower your young charges in terms of learning and educating yourselves in terms of nutrition, recovery, hydration, injury prevention. Having an effective support network is key. You guys are critical in that, but it's also friends, it's peers, you know, it's mentors, it's role models. And then lastly, the ability to bounce back, from seemingly negative chance events, injury. How can we prevent injury better? But how can we bounce back, from injury as well, but minimise injury mostly. And then at the top, these are the key things to get to the top, to podium. It's having that optimal preparation, dedication. It's that prior exposure, before those key international events. A lot of these athletes, when they go to their first event, they're sussing out what it's like, but they've got this hunger, a very strong self-belief that they deserve to be there. They want to be there and they're committed and driven to getting back there. They'll do everything to get there and to achieve. And critical to that is their psychological robustness, and I'll talk about that in a minute. A very factorial profile that they've got psychologically. With that, they can manage multiple stressors and do that with experience better and better each time. They've got the right support team. They've got a very strong individualised approach. At that level, they've got a voice, a very strong voice in really dictating, who is going to support them at key events. So they should be empowered and enabled to do that. And then they commonly reinvent themselves. There's a longevity. They reinvent themselves and economise in training, or they try a different, position in the team, or, a different event. So anyway, that's a lot of the evidence that we're finding. And as you can see, that's key evidence that can really help in terms of shaping, the strategy of supporting athletes and the support and the education that we provide. So I talked about stressors. In the questionnaire, we asked the athletes what stressors did they have to grapple with, and we got ranked from the top, lack of financial support, which is a no-brainer, but this is ranked from the highest down to the lowest, and we found that on average, pre-elite athletes and elite athletes are dealing with 4 to 7 concurrent stressors. So 4 to 7 of these things all at the same time. And you think that can be quite daunting for a pre-elite athlete. They're still maturing, and trying to, hi John, I just know another colleague in the back there, grappling with all these stressors. So this is the reality. A lot of these things you can't avoid. This is the reality of being a pre-elite athlete or an elite athlete. We learnt about the psychological profile of our finest. Again, we're using this information to then look at how we profile younger athletes and how we can help support, develop this psychological profile, because we know it's key for them withstanding the journey and excelling at the very top. And it was a no-brainer. We could see that they're strong in self-regulation, they've got a growth mindset, that it's always the half glass full, it's a more optimistic, positive outlook. They love to learn, and problem solve. They crave learning. That's really important. They practice mindfulness, so being in the present. They're mentally tough, they're resilient, they're hardy, they show a lot of grit. They've got exceptionally good coping skills, but that's come through a lot of experience and support and developing those psychological skills. And importantly, they have a lot of social support. They really perceive that they're supported adequately. That's really, really key. So it's not just their psychological profile, but they've got to have this external support too, which is really important. And that optimistic outlook, and they've got to be highly motivated. They're going to have strong confidence, and they're going to be a bit perfectionistic too, with their training, with their preparation, and be dedicated. So as you can see, it's quite a big profile, but it's really, really great to use this information when we ID young talent and we're developing, that we can start to work on some of these aspects and help nurture so that these athletes have this full gamut of a profile to help them, endure the journey and to perform well. Now, I've got a dear colleague that used to work with one of these authors here, Chelsea Waugh, Anna. This is a wonderful project through the UK where they interviewed, and I strongly recommend you read it. I can give you the link to it, but they interviewed 31 gold medalists from Great Britain, and it was really interesting. And what I touched on before, a commonality, a lot of these athletes, is that they had to deal with setbacks, massive setbacks early on in their career, but that really then propelled them up to get to where they got to. So it's really interesting. We found it in our data too. So these athletes seem to grapple with a lot of negative sort of seemingly chance events, injury, loss of someone, but for some reason their psyche makes them more determined, they're seeking more and meeting that challenge. So it's very interesting to learn about, I guess, the psyche, but knowing that setbacks and disappointment, and dealing with it pragmatically and looking at it in a true perspective really is a hallmark, commonly of the very best to get to the top. And I guess this is another great paper you can look at, where this model here, and it looks a bit abstract here, but basically it was a great paper here where again it was these authors interviewed some Olympic gold medalists from the UK, and again they could see that these medalists, they had to deal with stressors, which we know, that's a commonality of the athlete experience. But I guess with the right psychological profile and then also with the right social support and the more experience that you develop dealing with those stressors, the better, the more facilitative response that these athletes have. So every time they get to, I guess, negotiate another chance event, they've got that psychological profile, that experience, that support to better cope and deal and meet the challenge of subsequent stressors. So this is a great paper, and I think has a lot of inference for how we, expose our young athletes, and to help develop their coping skills, but with the right support so that they can really, I guess, autonomously endure the journey. So team podium, we know family, partner, support staff is important, but also the coach. We learnt about what the coach-athlete partnership looks like, and it truly is a partnership. And the athletes were saying that they really needed a confidant, at the very top for a coach. At the very top, it's not about instruction, but it's about, someone listening to you and sharing the journey and an outlet as well. With peers, we touched on that. Peers, as I said, can be wonderful in terms of support, but has to be carefully managed as well. And mentors, we found that mentors are critical as a catalyst for the journey, and they could be another athlete, a retired competitor, a teacher, and again they provide all these different types of support. And then we got some great information about role models. So we could see that role models were really inspiring a lot of our very great athletes as well. They really observed a lot from these role models and then utilised a lot of that information, for their own journey as well. So I guess all that information led to the development of our top 10 tips for parents resource. On the left here, I put together an online resource with information and links, so you can go to that. And on the right here, I did a whole series of podcasts, so you can listen to each of the top 10 tips, and I address each of them in the podcast. So that was lots of fun doing it. It's the first time I had done it. So it was quite interesting. But in the top 10 tips, we talk about how can you promote fundamental movement skills at home, with your young children. How can you foster the free play, at home. At that time, I copped a bit of flack in the media. I think my hairstyle, maybe I looked a bit like Carol Brady, but I think they cottoned on that I was doing a bit of corridor cricket with the little fellas, so I copped a bit of flack from the ABC, which was interesting when this was launched. But I still maintain the corridors pretty good, actually, if you got the right balls, to play. There's information there about how you can be a positive support, for your kids in sport. Finding the right sport format, in regards to the maturational level of your kid. But also the right sport equipment as well, because if you don't have the right sport equipment, it can really constrain, the skill development as well. It can lead to injury. About sampling, how you can promote sport sampling. Practice, it's not about the 10,000 hour rule, too much quantity can lead to dropout, to burnout, to injury. It's about quality, being smart in terms of practice, practicing how you'd compete, and using your full profile. So I talk a bit about that. About being a positive role model. So what you can do to help as a parent, to sell a more positive self, I guess, because your kids, these kids are, well, my boys, they always pull me up when I'm screaming at the Canterbury Bulldogs. So I've got to watch myself, I get a bit passionate. So it's just about, I guess, understanding that they're very good observational learners. So you've got to be careful, I guess, what you say, but you can be passionate and encouraging. So it's just a few words of wisdom, I guess, from my own learning in that regard. The right questions to ask. This is about promoting self-regulation, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Being sport ready, having that full gamut of education about what it takes to be a good athlete. And then finally, finding the right fit of developmental environment. What's the right fit of coach and club for your kid in terms of their maturation and their enjoyment and fun in sport. And that's really critical. So I strongly urge you to go, and if you haven't seen it, go and look at the website and listen to the podcasts. And just to finish off, I'll focus on 2 of these points, and I'll talk about the right questions to ask and how to be sport ready. And I'll talk about how you guys as parents can help facilitate both of these. You can empower these in your young charges, your kids. So the right questions to ask, really that's all about self-reflection, self-reflection and learning. How you can help your child to better learn, from practice, from training, from their competitive experiences, and how you can help them to self-reflect, to think about what they did, what they could do better, to problem solve, what they can do next time. So it's a whole suite of questions that you could ask to help promote that. And I found that through doing this, it's actually helped me, and I realised I was doing self-reflection too, and self-regulation, in the work that I do too. So I guess it's a bit of a cyclical process where you plan for an event, you think you've got it all sorted, you do the event, and your self-awareness is there, and you can work out where you might have missed or you might have done really well. And then it's about evaluating, how you went, what you could do better. And as you can see, it's a bit of a cyclical process that could be applied to a sporting event, it's a training and competition event. It could be preparing for a test, or a life event. It's a really critical suite of questions and I guess cognitive thinking. And it will really help, we've found, in terms of motivating the athlete, but also helping in terms of focusing their effort and also their self-efficacy, how they feel, their confidence, their self-confidence in themselves and in their potential. So in the podcast and the website material, I talk about what you can do to plan better. So it's about smart goal setting. How do you do that? How do you prepare routines and rituals? We've seen Rafa Nadal do his routine and rituals, which is interesting, but it's there for a reason, and it's understanding that. And that routines and rituals, the great cricketers did that too. And that was key to them switching on and switching off. So it's actually a really, really important thing psychologically for athletes. It's about visualisation, imagery. Imagery is actually watching yourself in your mind's eye from different perspectives. I use that in volleyball, if I couldn't do a certain hit, and I used to practice it in my mind, and it's so powerful and it's so underutilised, using that to perfect a skill. So there's some, hello, how you going? So there's some really good, I'll show you on the AIS brainwaves, they've got some great resources there. So while we focus a lot on physical and technical skill development, don't forget about visualisation and the importance of psychological skill development. That's really, really key. There's information too. We can talk about self-awareness, comparing to a benchmark, how to control your anxiety and your arousal. How much of that do you need? Concentration, positive self-talk is another big one. You know, you'll see a lot of athletes that do that positive self-talk externally, internally. It's really important. And then finally, after the event, you know, how do you look at the results pragmatically? How do you draw on external feedback to complement your own feedback? And how do you recalibrate? How do you go, okay, well, I need to address this issue. Who are you going to source? What are your solutions, your problem solving, you know, to deal and to attend to that issue? And how are you going to put that back into your next event? And that's really critical. And I've been very fortunate in this job, you know, to work with Lauren Burns. So again, Lauren Burns won the gold medal, Taekwondo at Sydney 2000. So I'm actually one of her supervisors for a PhD. And she's interviewed 10 Australian Olympians, amazing athletes. I can't tell you who they are. But we found that those athletes, their commonality was this. They were able to do this in terms of their training. So this cyclical reflection, self-learning, problem solving. They did it in training, they do it in competition, but they do it for the rest of their life. All aspects of their life is so fine-tuned that they work on solutions and experiment with solutions. They afford themselves to do that till they get it right. And that's where they can be perfectionistic and meticulous, you know, in their preparation. So it's been wonderful working with her, but it really highlighted how important this suite of skills is. So this is a great tool, Gibbs Reflective Cycle. So some of you guys probably be aware of this great tool. Again, it's a suite of questions in that cyclical sort of progression that you could help with your kids, you know, after a key event, after competition, after, you know, a test, you know, at school, you know, and walk them through those questions, and they can start to learn and use those questions themselves to really sort of propagate that self-reflection and learning and problem solving. So it's a really, really handy tool. Okay, just to finish off, number 9, we talked about being sport ready. So there's a lot to grapple here with, you know, to be sport ready in a holistic sense, you know, for an athlete. But this is something that you guys can really help out with your kids. But I reckon you'll get something out of it too. You know, I found that I've learnt a lot. So there's some great resources, and I'll share that in a minute, where you can learn about the importance of having a sound athletic base, the fundamental movement skills and physical literacy, why that's so important to minimise injury and to help fulfil talent potential. There's great information on how to do a warm-up and a cool-down appropriately, the timing of that. Information on how to minimise injury, but how to manage injury as well. Understanding the importance of good nutritional habits, that's really, really important. Nutrition, good nutrition is so critical, you know, in terms of regeneration and fuel, as you know. In terms of hydration, hydration's commonly missed. One of the fellows I worked with, the ISC, is the world guru in hydration for tennis. He'd worked with Pat Rafter because Pat Rafter realised that he was losing points because he wasn't hydrating properly. So Michael Bergeron was working with him on how to better hydrate, so that in terms of getting, you know, drinking enough, because you lose so much in terms of competition. So it's a really critical thing. And also about exercising safely in hot and cold environments. The importance of not overtraining or over-competing is really key. Understanding the importance of rest and recovery, that is just as important. Sleep and recovery and nutrition to actually, you know, doing the activity, you know, training and competition. It's so important for these growing bodies and growing minds, you know, that they've got enough time to regenerate and recoup. It's so important. And then finally, how to maintain a healthy sport-life balance. You know, that it's not just all sport, that there's a balance to life, the rest of life, to family, to friends. That's so important. So anyway, I've got listed on your handouts some really great resources. So you can go to the ISC consensus statement that has some of the information on there. But the AIS put together, their psychology department put together brainwaves. And brainwaves are some sheets, fact sheets that you guys can access, and it's got great information about concentration, motivation, self-regulation, imagery. So that's a really good start. AIS nutrition resources, you know, we have Professor Louise Burke, IAC recognised, heading up nutrition at the AIS. Go to these resources, they are world class in terms of adequate nutrition, hydration, meal planning, has recipes. You know, you probably saw some of the AIS books, recipe books, they're brilliant, but she's world class. So it's a fantastic resource to go to. AIS Performance Recovery Resources, again, a world class lady leading this, Dr. Shona Halson. Go to there. There's some in the clearinghouse at the Australian Sports Commission. If you're not a member, you can sign up and you can get these great fact sheets about adequate sleep, about adequate recovery, wonderful evidence-based, backed up by research, all this information. And then lastly, the IOC, the consensus statement before we did ours was on injury and injury prevention. And out of that, they use that information to put together an app. So you can go to the IOC website, I think it's in iTunes too, and it's called Get Set Train Smarter. And it's a wonderful app that you can go to, and it gives you information about injury prevention, you know, for your key sports. So again, it's informed by consensus statement, international level, but also that key evidence. So it's top-notch advice. And then lastly, I guess I touched on, there is another resource if you've got access to it, your young charges have got access to this, or they might have access this year, but certainly, you know, ask about it. And it's My AIS Basecamp, and it's like an online program that they developed at the AIS in the Pathways area where I used to work, and it has a lot of the information about the importance of postural strength. So there's a lot of video-based information there about postural strength, about running technique, about strength training technique, and about ball skills. So a lot of information there, video-based. And there's also the ability for kids, once they go up, and there's 5 levels with about 15 lessons in each of the 5 levels. Once they finish a level, they've got to upload a video doing a competency test for each of these, and then it's scored, and if they're proficient enough, they're able to go up the next level and they get feedback that's provided by the AIS. So a lot of investment went into this, and there's a lot of good content in there. You can download the PDFs too, and there's some really great lesson plans, you know, in there for coaches as well. There's great information in there, you know, for the kids on all the things we talked about. You know, nutrition, psychology, hydration, performance analysis, how to video themselves and how to get that feedback at their technique, recovery, personal excellence, about time management, you know, balancing school and sport, how they do that effectively, and physical preparation. And the nice thing about this platform is there is an area too for Basecamp buddies. So you guys are what we deem Basecamp buddies. So you're someone like a coach that you're doing the journey, you're facilitating the journey with your athlete, and there's a special area for you to actually to grab some information too and help your athlete or your young child or your kid on their journey as well. The great thing about this resource is it has a lot of the athlete's voice in it. So we've got some great learning, some videos from Anna Mears, you know, from Kim Crow, you know, all our great Olympians and Paralympians, and they're sharing their own journey and their own advice, and we found that that really resonates with the young athletes, you know, actually hearing it from Anna Mears, you know, how important self-regulation is and what she does is just so powerful. So it's wonderful. I'd like to also really showcase this wonderful resource. So I've done a bit of work with Swimming Australia, but with Dan Kowalski, with the Australian Swimmers Association, they put together this wonderful resource because they realised they needed more resources for parents and for athletes about how they can better support them, on the journey. And this is a wonderful website. So if you haven't seen it, definitely go to it. It's got great video-based content. A lot of our best Paralympic swimmers and Olympic swimmers sharing their story. There's a lot of great things in here about body image, about nutrition, about dealing with peers. So it's a wonderful, wonderful website. They've done a tremendous job. So certainly have a look at that too. And then finally, working with Swimming Australia, another great thing they did, if you go to that website, Swimming Queensland, they've got some great developmental resources. I helped out with a couple of those from the My Sporting Journey questionnaire and that evidence. And what they did on the right there is they put posters together. So they put one poster for recovery. So what are the key messages for parents and coaches for recovery? What are the key aspects for nutrition? And what are the key aspects in terms of development? And they put these posters poolside, which was really cool, so that parents could see it, the kids can see it, whenever they go to a swimming meet. So there's all different ways that you can sort of spread the message, that education of what the key things are to help support, your athletes.